Hey everybody, today's video is called The Fall of Jerusalem. And today we wrap up our pass-through study here in the book of Jeremiah, which we began this book back on September 4th, right after Labor Day, I believe it was. So between the last almost 4 months, we've been in this one book. And it's been quite a year in our Bible studies this year, if you've been with me from start to finish through today. We finished up the book of Job right around February, I believe it was. And then we studied the book of Ecclesiastes. We looked at the book of Song of Solomon. We looked at Isaiah for most of the summer and into most of the spring and into the fall time. And then now Jeremiah from September through now. In this chapter, we're going to find is very close to being identical to 2 Kings chapter 24 and 2 Kings chapter 25. If you were to grab a Bible on the side and open up to those chapters, you follow along, you're going to see it's very similar to what we're going to look at today in Jeremiah 52. And it's detailing the historical fall of Jerusalem. And it fittingly opens with her last king and his sin back in 597 to 596 BC. 597 to 586 BC, correction. And the purpose of the chapter is to show how accurate Jeremiah's prophecies were concerning Jerusalem and Judah. And nearly every verse has fulfilled prophecy in today's chapter. And some theologians argue that Baruch authored the final chapter rather than Jeremiah. And if you don't know who Baruch is, or you forgot, he was the scribe that wrote what Jeremiah received as prophecy. So we're going to look at chapter 52. I know we're a couple minutes in from a little bit of talk here. And we're going to look at Jeremiah chapter 52, open up with verse 1 through 3. So first off, we see the King Zedekiah was 21 years old when he became king, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Hamutal, the daughter of Jeremiah of Libnah. He also did evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all that Jehoiakim had done. For because of the anger of the Lord, this happened in Jerusalem and Judah, till he finally cast them out of his presence. Then Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. So make note in verse 1 here that Jeremiah mentioned in verse 1 is not the prophet Jeremiah. It is important to recognize that. And Zedekiah was a failure in pursuing pure worship. And we see that Zedekiah as king did evil in the sight of the Lord. And 2 Kings 24 verse 17 tells us that Nebuchadnezzar set Zedekiah on the throne of Judah as some sort of like puppet king after the rebellion of Jehoiachin. And it also tells us that his former name was Mattaniah when you look at 2 Kings 24:17. And Zedekiah means the Lord is righteous. And you can also check out 2 Chronicles chapter 36 verse 11 through 20 to tell more of his evil and the mocking and disregarding the message as he would not listen to the Lord's prophet. And remember that Jeremiah 32 spoke that Jeremiah warned Zedekiah that he would not succeed in his rebellion against Babylon, and Zedekiah had him arrested and imprisoned for this. And we were in that chapter here, I can't remember how many weeks ago now. I think maybe about 2 months ago or so. And Zedekiah, he loved the words from the false prophets. He had what we would call today as Christians itching ears. He wanted to hear what he wanted to hear and disregard everything else that he did not want to hear. In verse 4 through 6 it says, Now it came to pass in the 9th year of his reign, in the 10th month, on the 10th day of the month, that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and all his army came against Jerusalem and encamped against it. And they built a siege wall against it all around. So the city was besieged until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. In verse 6, by the 4th month, on the 9th day of the month, the famine had become so severe in the city that there was no food for the people of the land. So verses 4 through 6, we see the method of attack was common those days would build in walled cities a siege wall to surround the city to prevent all business and trade from entering or leaving the city, to eventually starve the population into surrender. And the narrative of verses 4 through 11 rehearses the account of the fall of Jerusalem, so crucial that the Old Testament actually speaks about the fall of Jerusalem, the event, 4 different times in 2 Kings 25, 2 Chronicles 36, verse 11 through 21, Jeremiah 39, we also looked at back a few weeks back, and today's last chapter, Jeremiah 52. And these 3 verses covered 18 months of agony. And verse 7 through 11 says, "Then the city wall was broken through, and all the men of war fled and went out of the city at night by the way of the gate between the 2 walls, which was by the king's garden, even though the Chaldeans were near the city all around. And they went by way of the plain. But the army of the Chaldeans pursued the king, and they overtook Zedekiah in the plains of Jericho. All his men were scattered from him. So they took the king and brought him up to the king of Babylon at Riblah in the land of Hamath, and he pronounced judgment on him. Then the king of Babylon killed the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes, and he killed the princes of Judah in Riblah. He also put out the eyes of Zedekiah, and the king of Babylon bound him in bronze fetters, took him to Babylon, and put him in the prison until the day of his death." So Zedekiah, we see he made an effort to escape, and he failed as he was captured in Jericho plains. And while the Babylonians weren't known to be as cruel in their time period as the Assyrians, who conquered the northern kingdom 150 years earlier, they certainly made that Zedekiah's past sight was by witnessing the murder of his own sons. And I know Jeremiah didn't give those details here, but you can find that in, I believe, the book of 2 Kings in chapter 24 or 25. And then, so he witnesses the very last thing before he loses his eyesight is his sons being murdered. And then he spent the rest of his life blinded in darkness. And as we'll see, Lord willing, in February, Ezekiel 12:13, this was the fulfillment of it regarding Zedekiah shortly before the fall of Jerusalem. And we'll be, Lord willing, in the book of Ezekiel right around mid-January. We're going to do a very short pass-through in Lamentations later this week and next week, and then we'll go in Ezekiel. An ancient historian, Josephus, says that Nebuchadnezzar kept Zedekiah in prison until he died, and then buried him magnificently, as Jeremiah 34, verse 5, called for. In verse 12 through 14, it says, "Now in the 5th month, on the 10th day of the month, which was the 19th year of King Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard who served the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. He burned the house of the Lord and the king's house, all the houses of Jerusalem, that is, all the houses of the great, he burned with fire. And all the army of the Chaldeans who were with the captain of the guard broke down all the walls of Jerusalem all around." So the paraphrase in 2 Kings chapter 25 verse 8 reads the 7th day instead of the 10th day. And many critics of the Bible like to look at both accounts and be like, oh, there's a contradiction. Both writers can't agree on what day it is. And Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, started from Riblah on the 7th day, and he arrived in Jerusalem on the 10th day. And the 19th year is speaking of the 586 BC. And some argue that verse 12 is a minor copyist error. In verse 13, Solomon's great temple was now a ruin and stayed that way for many years until it was humbly rebuilt by the returning exiles in the days of Ezra. And the physical security in verse 14 is seen as now destroyed, and the city was no longer a place of safety and security. And the walls remained ruined until they were rebuilt by the returning exiles in the days of Nehemiah. In verse 15 through 19 says, Then Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, carried away captive some of the poor people, the rest of the people who remained in the city, the defectors who had deserted to the king of Babylon, and to the rest of the craftsmen. But Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, left some of the poor of the land as vine dressers and farmers. The bronze pillars that were in the house of the Lord, and the carts and the bronze sea that were in the house of the Lord, the Chaldeans broke in pieces and carried all their bronze to Babylon. They also took away the pots, the shovels, the trimmers, the bowls, the spoons, and all the bronze utensils with which the priests ministered. The basins, the fire pans, the bowls, the pots, the lampstands, the spoons, and the cups, whatever was solid gold and whatever was solid silver, the captain of the guard took away. So, verses 15 through 19, this was the third major wave of captivity taking the remaining people, all except the poor of the land. In verse 18-19, the conquerors plundered the magnificent Solomonic temple and took the articles to Babylon. In 1 Kings chapter 6 through chapters 8 describe these articles. And later, Belshazzar would use some of these at his immoral banquet, gloating over the victory he wrongly attributed to his gods in Daniel chapter 5, which, Lord willing, we will be in Daniel chapter 5, I believe, right around May, June. And also, my friend Brian Peckham is starting a study through the book of Daniel here, starting right after the new year. Not this first Saturday, but the second one on the 11th. In verse 17 through 23, we see the detailed inventory of all that the Babylonians looted from the temple. In verse 20 through 23 says, the 2 pillars, 1C, the 12 bronze bowls which were under it, and the carts, which Solomon had made for the house of the Lord. The bronze of all these articles was beyond measure. Now concerning the pillars, the height of one pillar was 18 cubits. A measuring line of 12 cubits could measure its circumference, and its thickness was 4 fingers. It was hollow. A capital of bronze was on it, and the height of one capital was 5 cubits, with a network and pomegranates all around the capital, all of bronze. The second pillar with pomegranates was the same. There were 96 pomegranates on the sides. All the pomegranates all around on the network were 100. So in verse 22, you can cross-reference it with 2 Kings chapter 25, verse 17, which reads 3. And there may have been 2 parts to the capitals, the lower part of the 2 cubits, and the upper part carved ornately of 3 cubits. And the lower may be omitted in 2 Kings 25, verse 17, as belonging to the shaft of the pillar. In verse 24 through 27 says, the captain of the guard took Seraiah the chief priest, Zephaniah the second priest, and the 3 doorkeepers. He also took out of the city an officer who had charge of the men of war, 7 men of the king's close associates, who were found in the city, the principal scribe of the army who mustered the people of the land, and 60 men of the people of the land, who were found in the midst of the city. And Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, took these and brought them to the king of Babylon at Riblah. Then the king of Babylon struck them and put them to death at Riblah in the land of Hamath. Thus Judah was carried away captive from its own land. So Babylon executed some of the Judean leaders as an act of power resentment over the 18-month resistance and of intimidation to prevent future plots. And when you look at the account given in 2 Kings 25, verse 19, it reads 5 instead of 7 men used in verse 25. And, you know, some call it a minor copyist error. some, have a field day over those types of differences between the accounts by the authors. But the king of Babylon had what seemed like complete rule over the former kingdom of Judah. And God gave his people, the tribes of Israel, the land some 860 years, in which they took it by faith and obedience. But we see they lost the land through idolatry and sin, because sin always has a cost. And note that Jeremiah does not once express his feelings or emotions describing the tragic downfall of his country here. You're actually going to have to wait till next year for us to see it, because I'm not getting into the book of Lamentations next until the start of next year. In the book of Lamentations, we're going to see the weeping and groaning. It's going to be a couple weeks of sad text, and you're probably like, well, you've gone over, quite a bit of sad parts of the Bible this year. We're only going to continue next year, Lord willing. And verse 28 through 30 says, "These are the people whom Nebuchadnezzar carried away captive in the 7th year, 3,023 Jews. In the 18th year of Nebuchadnezzar, he carried away captive from Jerusalem 832 persons. And in the 23rd year of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, carried away captive the Jews 745 persons. All the persons were 4,600. So if you like your math, you can draw that out in a picture for yourself if that makes you happy. But here we see the stages of deportation to Babylon are in 603 BC under Jehoiakim, which marked the beginning of 70 years of exile. And then in 597 BC under Jehoiachin, and then 586 BC under Zedekiah, with the fourth Amappin campaign in 582 to 581 BC. And the number may include only males in response to the assassination of Gedaliah. In verse 31 through 34, we'll wrap this up, because I know it's a busy day for many of you. Jeremiah 52:31 through the rest. "Now it came to pass in the 37th year of the captivity of Jehoiachim, king of Judah, in the 12th month, on the 25th day of the month, that evil Merodach, king of Babylon, in the 1st year of his reign, lifted up the head of Jehoiachin, king of Judah, and brought him out of prison. And he spoke kindly to him and gave him a more prominent seat than those of the kings who were with him in Babylon. So Jehoiachin changed from his prison garments, and he ate bread regularly before the kings all the days of his life. And as for his provisions, there was a regular ration given him by the king of Babylon, a portion for each day until the day of his death, all the days of his life." So verse 31, we see it's the 25th day of the month, while 2 Kings chapter 25 verse 27 reads the 27th. And it's probably that the decree was on the 25th day, but carried out on the 27th. In captivity of Jehoiachin since 597 BC, we see he appears here in 561 BC after Nebuchadnezzar's death, when evil Merodach ruled Babylon. And though detained, the former king was kindly freed to enjoy previously denied privileges. And the Lord did not forget the Davidic line, even in exile. In the absence of any reference to the decree of Cyrus permitting the people to return home in 539 BC, suggests that the book of Jeremiah reached its final form here before that date. In 2 Kings 24 verse 10 through 12 shows us that Jehoiachin was taken captive for many years, taken away to Babylon in bronze fetters. So to wrap up the study here at the end of the year of the book of Jeremiah, we look at the fall of Jerusalem and the captivity of Judah. And we looked at the siege and the conquest of Jerusalem with an evil reign and rebellion of the King Zedekiah. And we see it was the final siege of Jerusalem in verses 4 through 6. And then verse 7 through 11 showed us that King Zedekiah was captured and executed. Verse 12 through 14 of Jeremiah 52 showed us the destruction details of Jerusalem. And then verse 15 through 23 shows us the captives of those left on the land and the plunder under the Babylonians. And then Jeremiah 52 verse 24 through 27 shows us the authority of Nebuchadnezzar over Jerusalem and Judah. And verse 28 through 30 is the register of the final phase of the exile. Verse 31 through 34, we see close out the chapter with a small ray of hope seen in Jehoiachin's improved situation in Babylon. And I just want to take the next few minutes here to just thank you for closing out the year of 2024 with me in the book of Jeremiah. And thank you if you've been a long follower since start to finish of the year. And especially want to thank you guys who have been following for years or more than a year. And I hope that these studies have been a blessing for you as they have been for me. And I hope that you'll plan on continuing our next study. It's going to be a 2-week study in 2025 to kick off in a very depressing book called Lamentations. And this is actually really great to start a brand new book. And hopefully people that want to dive more into God's word and to build their knowledge on God's word will tune in as part of their goals in 2025. And I hope that you have a blessed New Year's Eve with loved ones and never take any moment for granted. Enjoy this evening with your friends and family and loved ones, because you do not know if you will get another opportunity come next New Year's Eve. And I'll be doing some traditions myself. My wife actually works on New Year's Eve at a Chinese restaurant. But we're going to be in the Bible with my children. We're going to close out our study through the book of Job this evening with root beer floats or screamsicle floats, whatever they choose. And we're also going to have, in New England, if you're from New England, you might be doing Chinese food this evening. It's like a huge New England type New Year's Eve thing. When I lived in Hawaii and Washington, Chinese food wasn't like a regular thing as a culture in those areas. So everything would close early. And like if you go to a Chinese restaurant here in Massachusetts, you're going to be having to put your order in early for the time you want it for, or else you might be waiting a couple hours. And when I was in Washington State and Hawaii, it was like nobody inside. It was nice and empty. Put in an order, pick it up pretty quickly. But also, we're going to be watching the ball drop tonight. And, we're all going to go to bed very shortly after. So no matter what your traditions are, you don't celebrate New Year's Eve, just be in God's word. And, do what you want to do and have a great evening. But we'll see you next year. God bless. And I'll let you know when we kick off that new study. So you might be like, yes, I don't have to listen to him again until next year. Bad news, I'll see you Thursday or Friday. God bless.